Hey everybody, Who's Your Jedi here with another review for you. This time I'm talking episode 2 of season 4 of Arrow called The Candidate. And I gotta say, this was definitely a really fun episode. Lots of cool stuff going on here this time around. So let's just get right into things, and let's get the flashback out of the way first, because I don't want to forget about it. Now, this episode continues to show us that old Flashback Ollie is indeed quite the ruthless fellow. The way he takes care of that enemy soldier, very all business. Slade, if he hadn't gone crazy, would have been proud. And on his Twitter before this episode aired, Stephen Amell said that this episode was going to be where we finally see a foe that has plagued the audience for 71 episodes, the entire run of the show, finally vanquished. And I was sort of scratching my head on that, and I started reading through the comments, and somebody in his Twitter comment suggested the idea of the wig, Oliver's flashback wig. Now, I personally have never thought that the flashback wig was really that bad. But then again, I didn't think China White's first wig was that bad either, and though I did, in all fairness, revise that opinion fairly quickly. So yeah, we do get to see Flashback Oliver finally ditch that wig and sort of adopt his basically his kind of current hairstyle. Although, of course, as we see from the first episode, that doesn't last until he gets rescued. This episode also serves to introduce us to Arrow's version of Baron Blitzkrieg. Oddly enough, Baron Blitzkrieg is, as by his name, basically a Nazi villain in the comics. Here, they're just going to be using his real name, which I don't recall off the top of my head, and he's apparently being played by a black dude. So if that's not in name only, I don't know what is. But yeah, so this does, like I said, it just does a nice job of sort of moving things along on the island. And once again, Oliver is back on Lian Yu and has apparently kind of taken a page out of H.I.V.E's book and joined up with what seems to be the bad guys. Of course, H.I.V.E did that for what he thought were practical, necessitary reasons of necessity. Here, Oliver is working undercover. So getting back to what's going on in the present day, this episode is the much hyped appearance of Jeri Taylor. Her coming on the show. Jeri Taylor, best known, of course, for playing Seven of Nine on Star Trek Voyager, and for all intents and purposes, that show in a lot of ways becoming the Seven of Nine show. Not that we can lay that at Jeri Ryan's feet. She, like everybody else on Voyager, was just a person doing their job with the best that they could, with a seemingly never-ending supply of terrible, terrible scripts. And that is why all of us who love Star Trek try not to think about Voyager too much or too often. Oh God, I can't believe I actually sat and watched every single episode of that show. Every single one. Do you know how many We're going to let that go. That's an old pain. It's an old pain. But the pain never goes away. Yeah, Star Trek Voyager really was, most of the time, that bad if you've never watched it. Anyway, so she's brought in as an old friend of Oliver's family who ultimately decides to run for mayor, which, okay, cool idea. Now, what really bothers me about this is that very quickly she goes from, this interesting lady who's coming in here to sort of try and win the role of mayor, when basically, as it's been flat out said, there's an entire city full of people who are too scared to take a crack at this. Which again, this is what really sort of what we get in this episode to sort of make us think of her as an interesting character. And then in very short order, she's basically just quickly reduced to crying lady on TV. Now, granted, if somebody tries to murder you and then shortly thereafter your child is kidnapped, well, you'd be hard-pressed not to be shedding a few tears there. So I'm not criticizing her character for that. I'm really kind of criticizing the show for not really doing anything with her character beyond those beats this episode. I'm not sure exactly how much she's going to be in this season. I think I read it somewhere, but I don't recall off the top of my head. But in any case, I think if you're going to have somebody with like Jerry Taylor on the show, you need to deliver something with a little bit more meat to it than that. Now, this episode we're also introduced to Lonnie Meacham. He is another character that the Arrow writers have plucked from Batman's Rogues Gallery. There have been a number of different characters over the years who've used the identity of Anarchy, and they're going with the name of the first one. But that Lonnie Meacham, well, he started off really as just some kid. I mean, literally, he was like not even in junior high school. He was just a ridiculously smart kid who one day picked up a book on political philosophy, read it, was mesmerized, started reading all these books on political philosophy, and eventually decided that anarchy it was the really ideal form of government. Now, I don't mean anarchy as in, Mad Max, people running around shooting each other and stuff. It was really just more like the people have the absolute maximum amount of control over their lives that is humanly possible with not answering to anybody else. And that was kind of his shtick, was pushing this political philosophy. But, the character never really did sit very well with me because as smart as he was, I mean, this was somebody who was basically, at most, old enough to drive. And, well, there's a reason why most people don't take their political cues from teenagers, even extremely smart teenagers. Because, well, life is a little bit more complicated than what we read about in books, or as is more in the case with more modern people, what you read on frickin' Tumblr. So, yeah, he was always for me a little bit of a character who was just a little bit too hard to take seriously because, well, again, there's a reason why people don't take political advice and political cues from teenagers. You can read as much theory and ideas as you like, but until you go out there and you live a little bit more and you experience a little bit more of the world and you have the perspective to really sort of interpret these ideas and things like that, then it's sort of a little bit hard to judge someone's opinion as being that credible. You do have to have a certain amount of life experience under your belt before people are going to take what you say seriously. And that's just a fact of life. And, I don't think it's a wrong one. Again, that's kind of one of the reasons why, people don't often take life advice on how to run their lives from teenagers, and why people are often very critical of college students. College students are masters of this. They go in there, they take a few sociology classes or a few political science classes, and they suddenly think that they're in a position to lecture everybody on their moral and social failings. And the folks who are, adults who've been out in the real world, they're like, yeah, I remember when I was your age and I thought like that too. Then I kind of got out in the world and realized that my views were a little bit simplistic. But enough ranting in that direction. Yeah, I might post these videos on Tumblr, but oh boy, sometimes that plays, huh? But anyway, getting back to this episode. So speaking of introduced characters, this time around we're introduced to the character of Curtis Holt, whose counterpart in the comics is named Michael Holt, and he is the superhero Mr. Terrific. Now, I was a little scratching my head as to, well, why is he called Curtis Holt on the show when his name in the comics is Michael Holt? So I was doing some checking on Wikipedia just to make sure I was remembering the character's name right. And apparently Curtis Holt is an alias that Michael Holt has used before. Also, different here, on the show, Curtis Holt is gay. He mentions having a husband. Mr. Mr. Terrific in the comics is a heterosexual guy. He was actually married and had a wife and son who unfortunately died in a car accident. And that was something that really hung over his head. So I think they might have sort of taken this, the name as sort of a nod to, but saying like, okay, by making this character gay, we're obviously going to be changing some very significant details about his life. So let's call him Curtis instead of Michael. It shows that we're giving the nod to this character, but that he is going to be notably different. Now, whether or not Curtis Holt is going to become Mr. Terrific, we'll just have to see how things play out over the course of the season. Mr. Terrific is sort of best known for his some of his best known tricks are these technological gadgets he has called T-spheres, and they're these little spheres that fly around him, and they help like show holograms and help him, I think, occasionally in combat. They're just sort of his sort of all-purpose technological Swiss Army knife that he has with him. So when Felicity goes and promises that Curtis is going to come up with some sort of technological marvel that's going to save the company, best guess is it's probably some sort of variation on the T-spheres. Again, speculation, but it is speculation that makes the most sense. Which I suppose is a good place to bring us into Felicity. Of course, now she's finally back from her little jaunt to Ivy Town with Oliver and is now having to really properly take control of the company. And she's finding out that it's not as much fun as she had hoped. I like that scene how she notes that, I don't have an MBA or any of those sort of degrees, which probably isn't really helping her credibility with the board members, who are all almost doubtlessly MBAs and graduate degrees in God only knows what type of business related fields, but okay, whatever. And it does get very quickly into her having to deal with the downsides of all this. The board is kind of basically looking to cut all these jobs, and as the person at the top, it's Felicity's job to deal with this. And to her credit, she fires all of these people personally. She doesn't pass it off to some human resources officer and hide in her office. She faces each and every one of these people and delivers the news personally. So if nothing else, she deserves a lot of respect for doing that. And then she comes up with this completely audacious and arguably even ridiculous plan that basically involves her and Curtis Holt pulling some kind of technological miracle out of their butts. So yeah, but seeing her and Curtis Holt, bounce off of each other, it's pretty cool. Two very smart, very nerdy, but very likable people who are kind of dealing with each other. I mean, that's cool. I get the feeling that these two are going to become very, very good friends, which is great. It's good to see. It would actually be good to see Felicity having a little bit of a social life that doesn't revolve around Team Arrow. Nothing really huge to say about Dig this episode, but to go back to Felicity for a moment, I really did love that moment when she talks about like, hey, can I get a code name? And they even mentioned like, yeah, we need to get a code name for I guess Diggle too. And that's one of the things I've complained about in these reviews before, and I've complained about on The Flash is Barry and Oliver always just saying things like John and Felicity and Cisco, where bad guys are potentially able to hear them saying the names of their friends. And that drives me absolutely crazy. If you actually watched the Vixen animated series that Grant Gustin and Stephen Amell did guest voices in, there was this part where Barry was talking to Cisco over the mic, and he says, like, Cisco something, blah, blah, blah. Then he realizes Vixen is close enough to hear him and says, not that anyone named Cisco is associated with me in any way, shape, or form. You're just like, oh, God, Barry, come on. So yeah, now a lot of people have kind of floated the idea of calling Felicity Oracle, and given the number of pages that we've seen lifted out of the Batman playbook, I'm cool with that. Just for legal reasons, they can never actually have Barbara Gordon or anything like that here on the show. Characters like Anarchy and Firefly, they can get away with, but not something like that. And you know what? I'm fine with the idea that in the Arrowverse, it's Felicity Smoke who becomes Oracle, and I hopefully Barbara Gordon just kind of gets to continue running around Gotham as Batgirl, kicking butt and being cool. But that's for another time. Oh, and how cool was it that when that little moment where Oliver gave Felicity the fern? That was pretty cool. So getting back to Team Arrow, nothing really huge to say about Laurel in general this episode, except for at the end. Now, it says a lot about what's going on in Laurel's head. That even after she's seen Thea try and attack, arguably try and kill, or at least attack her own brother, that she's willing to try and take Sarah's body to the Lazarus pit. I mean, Thea had only been dead for, or basically was about dead for a little while. So dropping Sarah in there, I mean, God only knows how crazy she's going to be when she comes out. Now, exactly how well Laurel understands this idea, I think is maybe up for a little bit of debate. But again, it really shows you that the loss of Sarah is something that has really perhaps not healed, or Laurel has not moved on as much as we think. And you have to wonder, well, is she wondering maybe like if Sarah comes back, is she going to be able enough? Her strength going to be enough to help us sort out this problem? What about what is this going to mean for her father and their admittedly strained relationship? I mean, it is really a big question mark exactly what's going on in her head there. I mean, we can see the obvious reasons why she would want to do it, but I mean, her exact thought process that I'm very curious about. And of course, this is a perfect place to jump on to Thea. At first she's very dismissive of Oliver and his whole thing, like, hey, you didn't need to be that violent. And it takes attacking her own brother to really drive that home to her. That scene where Oliver says, like, hey, you could have, that when you were fighting that ghost guy, you could have taken him down with a simple disarm, but instead you chose to do this elaborate thing that resulted in seriously hurting him. And it reminds me of this scene from Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, where Batman is fighting a group of thugs and he's like, okay, I've got, in my mind, I know 7 different ways to take these guys down. 3 of them will disarm them with minimal pain. The other 3 of the other ones will kill all of these guys. And the last one will hurt them. And that's the one he goes for, which says an awful lot about what Batman is like in The Dark Knight Returns, and probably more than a little bit about Frank Miller. But flawed or not, The Dark Knight Returns is still a story well worth reading, and well, Frank Miller's a bit of a mixed bag these days, but some of his older stuff is golden, folks. Golden. I'm very thirsty tonight, in case you haven't noticed. And incapable of drinking a glass of water without getting some of it on my face. Alright, so I've been talking for almost 20 minutes, so I think I should probably move this along. Nothing really huge to say about Damien Dark this episode. Just that it's a bit of a head scratcher why he has these moral qualms about kidnapping somebody's daughter when he's totally like, hey, let's let Starling City die, and is obviously been behind numerous acts of terrible, terrible, horrible things. So it feels like, oh, you're cool with all this murder and death, but kidnapping somebody's teenage daughter, threatening Quentin Lance's daughter, that you're cool with. I mean, to me, this just sort of really feeds sort of the idea that a lot of people have been throwing around that it's going to turn out that Felicity is his daughter. And again, at this point, that's still just speculation. But in terms of the whole thematic situation, I mean, imagine Quentin's reaction to finding out, huh? Oh yeah, and then there was the part where Oliver decided to run for mayor of Starling City, which totally happened in the comics. Or I should say Star City. But yeah, Oliver did actually manage to get himself elected mayor of Star City in the comics. So whether or not TV Oliver will be able to pull that off, whether or not he'll be mayor by day and vigilante by night, um, who knows? But given how interesting it would be if Oliver actually was elected mayor, I'm pretty cool with this idea. I mean, it's a very exciting idea, and to me, it really shows us and reminds us that Arrow is a show that's not afraid to take some chances, is not afraid to make these big shakeups in the status quo. So, with that, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to call it here. As always, please comment, rate, and subscribe, and of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Who's Your Jedi. Until next time, take care and have a good one.